Hello everyone. Welcome to NetDiligence Virtual Cyber Risk Summit. My name is Heather Osborne and I'm the Director of Global Events and Programming at NetDiligence, a cyber risk assessment and data breach services company. NetDiligence is pleased to bring our thought-leading content to the virtual space with this new webinar series. Visit our website at www.netdiligence.com to get more information about our upcoming webinars and in-person events. Before we begin, I'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our virtual Cyber Risk Summit sponsors, particularly Aspen Insurance, our diamond sponsor. I'd also like to thank our 100+ speakers for bringing their thought leadership to our program. For today's webinar, we will be using the ON24 platform. Right now, you should be viewing the ON24 dashboard, which shows the live viewing screen. During the webcast, all participants will be in listen-only mode. Today's presentation is slated for approximately 45 minutes, with 15 minutes at the end for questions. Our panel of speakers will be taking questions throughout the session via the questions widget. Please type in questions during the presentation and click submit. If your question is of immediate import or concerns technical problems, you will receive an immediate answer by text. You can also find a widget entitled Resources, where you can download assets provided by the speakers and sponsors for each webinar. Just click the resource in the box and it will be automatically downloaded. If you are interested in receiving CLE or CE accreditation for this program, you must stay on for the full duration of the webinar and answer 3 polling questions that will appear during the course of the program. Additionally, please fill out the participant information questions. This will ensure that you are correctly matched to the state and professional organization. As a reminder, this webcast is being recorded. After the presentation, you will receive an archive link for further review or for sharing. The webinar will also be available for future viewing on our website. Again, thank you for joining the NetDiligence Virtual Cyber Risk Summit. We hope you enjoy the program.
Good afternoon, good morning everyone. Thanks for joining us. We are all very impressed with the turnout for this session. This is one of a series of presentations that we are doing virtually so that we can continue the great work of NetDiligence. Obviously we're in this strange environment where an in-person conference is just not possible. So here we are. We're going to cover claims and losses today as advertised, and I've got a fantastic panel I'm going to introduce in just a second. We're going to be, as people probably know from past conferences, we'll be introducing the results of the NetDiligence Claims Study, talking about that with the panel, getting some insights and views on their experiences over the last 12 months in the cyber claims world. So the focus will be the slide deck that displays the results of that study, and we'll be dipping in and getting panel feedback on that as we move through it. So without further ado, I'll introduce the panel really quick. And least important on the panel is myself, Simon Oddy. I'm with Tilly. I'm an accountant by training, and our world is really around the damages resulting from cyber claims and losses. I've been doing forensic accounting for about 22 years, originally from England, and have been living in New York for about 15 years. Also joining us on the panel, as you can see from the screen, is Mark Greisiger. I think everybody knows Mark. Mark is the founder of NetDiligence, where he's been running that organization since, I believe, 2001. I actually met Mark probably in and around 2001, I think, at one of the first events that he ran with NetDiligence. NetDiligence, a cyber risk assessment and data breach services company, and I think many people know of the good work that they do. Also on the panel, I'll follow along in the order that we have on screen here. We've got Joe Niemczyk and Markel, and I've worked with Markel on a number of occasions, and he has a true passion for this sector of the business, and it's always fun to work with Joe for that reason. He's senior counsel with Markel's Global Cyber Risk and Privacy Liability Unit, and in that role he's responsible for the administration of cyber risk claims on a really wide spectrum of industries. We're pleased to have Joe involved. Prior to Markel, he was actually a lawyer, so he's got that legal defense attorney background that I think he brings to his day-to-day role. So good to have him on the panel. Also today we've got Marissa Olsen, who currently is Vice President Claims Counsel, Cyber Liability at Aspen Insurance. She's responsible for overseeing cyber, privacy, technology, and media claims for national and international corporations. So wide area of experience for her as well. It's great to have her on the panel. Looking forward to some insights from Marissa. Prior to working at Aspen, she's gained experience with Coalition, as well as Sampo International and also AIG. And then prior to that, a really distinguished career, she's also got experience from a private law practice, so she brings that to the table as well, which is excellent. And finally, but not least, last but not least, I should say, is Jennifer Coughlin, who I think everybody knows. Jennifer's a founding partner at Mullen Coughlin. She focuses her practice solely on providing organizations of all sizes and industry sectors with first-party breach response and third-party privacy defense legal services. She's represented numerous organizations, really broad experience, including healthcare centers, healthcare treatment, financial institutions, hospitality providers, online brick-and-mortar retailers, hotels, and other professional services. So huge breadth of experience on the panel, and we hope to be able to explore that today. So we will launch into the presentation actually by testing the audience here a little bit. We have a polling question. There will not be any certificates given out for whoever gets this right or whoever indeed gets it wrong. But NetDiligence has been producing the NetDiligence Cyber Claims Study for how many years now? I think there have been a couple of clues given a moment ago, but is it 10 years, 5 years, or 2 years? Okay, move it on. So our objective today as a panel is really to try and share some insight from the claims study as we talked about, and also our own experiences. You know, the intent is to give you, the audience, just some shared experience really, so that you can take that away and it will allow you to have a better understanding either for the work you're doing or the work you will be doing in the next 12 months or so. It's really to allow informed decision making. I think if we look back at the claims trends and the claims studies, it gives us an insight into what we might expect and how to handle things that are coming around the corner. So it's all about enhancing claims management, and it's all about really creating claim preparedness for the policyholders. So really dipping into what we've seen in the past, and maybe we can pull some lessons from that. So that's part of our objectives today. The agenda for today is to run through the claims study. As I've mentioned, we've got some great charts and slides that Mark's going to walk us through in a minute. We'll then talk after that about the developing claims trends. It would be impossible to ignore COVID-19, so we will touch on that a little bit. But I think we'll try and break down the claims trends discussion into sort of pre-February, I guess, what we were seeing then, and maybe a little discussion of what's happened since. We'll talk about privacy and cybersecurity claims. We'll dip into the impact on regulatory investigations in the last 12 months or so. And then we'll talk about impacts and trends on other business lines, how things have changed over the last 12 months. Just to keep everybody on their toes, we're going to hit you with another question right out of the gate. So the average ransomware payment in the last 12 months was, we've got 4 choices there, less than 100,000, between 100,000 and 500,000, greater than $500,000, greater than 1 million. So if you want to take a moment to think about that and submit an answer, that would be great. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Mark Greisiger, who's going to walk us through the findings of the most recent NetDiligence study. And the panelists will, as they see appropriate, jump in with some observations as we go through this.
Simon, thank you, and I'm honored here to be here today. Everybody with us, fantastic, my fellow panelists here. And I miss seeing everybody smiling faces in a live audience, so hopefully the next one, but still looking very, very forward to doing this today. So as Simon mentioned, we've been doing this now for over a decade. We've had the good fortune of supporting many of the leading cyber risk insurance carriers. And for customer education, industry awareness sake, each year they give us a sampling of their cyber claims. And we trend that information, we produce a report for industry education, and today I just want to give you some highlights of what we're seeing in the latest 2020 study. So new claims that were submitted were over 1,600. You'll see in some of the analysis, we actually, besides looking at the current year, like to also give a snapshot of the past 5 years. So we go back to 2015 with a sample size of about 3,500 or so. This is very much a cyber claim study focused on SMEs, Main Street companies as opposed to Wall Street companies. Although there are some very large companies that have cyber claims, and we try to capture some of that. For the most part, a lot of the carriers out there are seeing a tremendous amount of claims in the small, middle-sized type companies. As you can see here in the pie chart, 98% were SME size. We categorize the SME size by revenue size. I believe the average here, you can see bottom left here, is about $92 million in revenue. If you are considered a large company, the average revenue size is about $11 billion. On the right-hand side, so the average cyber claims was about $100,000 in 2019. If we looked at a 5-year window snapshot, 2015 to 2019, we're looking at about $164,000 average claim. Again, SME size, to an SME client, speaking to brokers and those kind of customers, that's a life-threatening event to them. To a larger organization, it's a very different picture here, as you can see in the bottom. The average large organization cyber claim is about $12 million. Looking at a broader window, 2015 to 2019, it dropped slightly down to about $8.5 million. If there were legal costs involved, and very often there is because of breach coach counsel, and Jen Coughlin will go into some of this later on, as well as battling plaintiff lawyers coming after clients. You have state and regulator enforcers. Often that triggers some kind of legal costs. SMEs were facing about $82,000. A larger company, about $1.5 million. Let's talk a little bit about ransomware. This is, as we're going to hear not only in our panel discussion, but in other NetDiligence Summit conferences, a leading cause of loss now within the industry. I find it very interesting. Pearl, it's very challenging because we see it rapidly changing, literally on a weekly basis. When we talk to some of the leading forensic experts who are battling these belligerent threat actors every day, they're seeing so much change. Just trying to stay on top of things is incredible. We're seeing now threat actors referring to themselves as syndicates and cartels for variants like Maze and now R-Evil, which are the new norm now is actually data exfiltration, which is triggering not only losses that we're going to go through here for business interruption, loss of paying Bitcoin out, but also now there's potential privacy breaches because the threat actors are threatening to, or oftentimes doing so, publishing private information on customers. And so the other thing that we're seeing, again, in the rapid change category, in talking to many of the experts, is some of the latest variants are now opening up auctions, which is creating new types of threats and perils where they're doing things that you might read about in online auctions, like a blitz price of sale of all your customer data, or a buy now of all your customer data because the client unfortunately failed to send in the right amount of Bitcoins to the threat actor. So there's just a lot of stuff happening. We show here in this slide, and going back to 2014 all the way up to 2019, what has been the change in the average losses, cyber claims in the ransomware area? Again, SME focused, because they're the ones majority having these kind of losses. Starting out anywhere from $36,000 for a ransomware actual demand to last year $72,000, and this year it more than doubled, $175,000. If you're looking at the whole incident cost, that being the cost to bring in experts to help the client ascertain, who, what, when, where, and how, stop the bleeding, help them recover a little bit, that figure is much higher. As you can see, last year was about $91,000. This year, more than tripled, up to $275,000. On the right-hand side, folks, we just try to give a breakout of some of the leading sectors seeing ransomware claims. And no surprises here, but healthcare, professional services, manufacturing leading the pack. I mean, look at the manufacturing average incident cost alone, close to $500,000.
Mark?
Yeah, Simon, please.
Mark, if I may, I was just going to make a quick comment on that last slide, and we can do it here while we're looking at this one. I think that's fine. I'm just curious, and I know the data's not in front of you perhaps, but that chart that showed the different sectors that are being affected most, I think healthcare was at the top, and then maybe financial services. Has that shifted a lot over the last 4 to 5 years, or has it remained pretty static? It feels to me that it's remained the same, but I wasn't sure if that's what the study has shown as well.
It's remained fairly static. It seems like healthcare, professional services are always fighting for the top spots. I feel like manufacturing has come up in the pack from years past, where they really didn't care that much about your standard privacy breach. This, ransomware, where you have first-party loss, business interruption, is a game changer for them because now their supply chain systems are often impacted, and it's just more devastating. But yes, it's been a consistent list.
I mean, that's in line with what we've seen. That last comment about manufacturing, we've seen, I would say, our team over the last 2 to 3 years has really seen an increase in manufacturing losses that we're involved with, and primarily because of that business interruption issue, really. And I think the attackers know you take down a system and create that disruption, even without any personal data being released, you've still got a problem that they need to respond to. So, that's in line with what we saw. Thank you.
Yeah. So, obviously, cyber risk, we put air quotes around that, is broader than just ransomware and privacy breaches. We have business interruption, and again, impacting SMEs and business email compromise. On the business interruption, that can be caused from a ransomware event, but it also could be triggered by denial of service attacks, for example. So average business interruption exposure or incident costs was about $257,000 in this current year. And if we looked at a 5-year snapshot, it was close to $400,000 in the total incident cost. For business email compromise, this is mostly wire fraud, because the bad guys are masquerading as the CEO, instructing their controller to maybe send out a wire payment. And very common, a common claim these days. I think a lot of the carriers had this as either number 1 or number 2, right behind ransomware or right in front of it. But the average for an SME business email compromise this current year of 2019 was $83,000. And if we looked at the larger window going back to 2015, it was about $124,000. And we'll go over some very simple loss control measures that can mitigate all these exposures. Some on this panel, but in other NetDiligence Summit panels. I also like to look at criminal versus non-criminal, the origins of the claims. And for whatever reason, I was asking my analytic researchers, why did it go down this past year? They could not explain it to me because I feel like ransomware is definitely in the category of being criminal. But this is where the numbers play out. Sometimes I think it's just the way the claims folks categorized it, and it might not be 100% of what the industry is saying. I want to talk briefly about the types of data typically caught up in these claims. Not many surprises here. We would have PHI files, what clients call files critical. Could be email. We also had non-card financial files and PII, personal identifiable information. So those were kind of the leading file types. On the right-hand side, we talk a little bit about the revenue size of the victim organizations that were having the claims. heavily, this is really what this pie chart just represents, the SME space. Most of the organizations, as you can see, were on the smaller side, less than 50 million in revenue. I think we did do an average, though, including the larger entities in our study. The average for an SME came out to about $92 million, but still a relatively modest-sized organization. Sectors, this is a little bit repetitive, Simon, but even though it's touching on the overall cyber claims, not just ransomware, but healthcare, professional services, retail, and manufacturing leading the pack there. And I mentioned early on, causal loss, ransomware, hacker, staff mistakes still happening, business email compromise were the top 4 here. So folks, everybody can find our studies. We have 3 versions for the public right on our website at netdiligence.com. You can download. If you have access to a carrier's eRisk Hub, you can find deeper dive versions of this. And we want to thank our students who each year support us enough so we can pay our researchers and the whole process of publishing this. So thank you to RSM this year. And with that, I'm going to back over to my colleague, Simon.
Thanks, Mark. That's great. Thank you. I mean, the takeaways from what I saw there and I've seen studying it is the costs are growing. There's no surprise to anybody that's dealing with these claims on a day-to-day basis. There hasn't been, as we talked about a moment ago, there hasn't been a huge shift in the sort of main targets of these attacks. Not yet, anyway. We're certainly seeing, as we've talked, that on many occasions we're seeing the emergence of business interruption loss more and more, and then the financial costs associated with that. So, my sort of data highlights summary is, ransomware, business email compromise continue to be obviously big problems. The study focuses on SMEs, but I mean our experience, and I think the panel will talk about it in a minute. I think the SMEs are the ones that sort of feel this. They feel the pain with one of these attacks. I don't think they've got necessarily the resources available to them, or maybe that's changing. We'll find out in a minute when we talk to the panel. But I feel like they certainly feel the impact of one of these attacks much more significantly than maybe a larger company that's ready to deal with it from a business continuity perspective. I said BI is on the increase, and then the 4 industries we focused on there. So I'm going to turn to the panel really and get some, the breadth of experience we've got on this panel. Let's sort of take what we just saw there, take our experience over the last 12 months or so and beyond, and let's just talk about what sort of trends we're seeing. It's probably worth breaking down into sort of pre-COVID and post-COVID. And I will say on behalf of all our panelists is with COVID-19 as it stands, there's obviously a lot of insurance issues that remain unresolved out there in the marketplace. So I think the message really is that the discussion is to not provide any coverage opinions, not to provide legal decisions, but really just to try and explore what we're seeing up to sort of February and what we've seen in terms of the trends after that. So I guess just to kick things off, one of the stats I've found is that there's been about a 35% increase since 2016 in the cost of cybercrime, yet only an increase in cybersecurity expenditure of about 10%. So there's a bit of offset there. Stepping away from some of the data, anybody want to sort of jump in and talk about the trends you saw there and whether they are in line with the things you've seen in the last 12 months, or whether there's some anomalies there or some anomalies you've seen that don't fit in with what we saw? Maybe I'll turn to Joe first.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I think Mark hit the nail on the head when he was talking about ransomware. I mean, what we're dealing with here is very sophisticated threat actors who recognize that they need to maintain creativity and they need to create new ways of, coercing victims to pay the extortion demand. So Mark touched upon 2 of the main trends that we started seeing coming into 2020, which was the exfiltration of data. Before, it was a matter of locking down the data, taking advantage of that fact. But now what threat actors are doing is they're taking their time. They're finding a way into an entity's, network, sitting there for a little while, understanding where the backup is, if they can infiltrate not only the network, but the backup. So if there's no backup, there's more of an incentive to pay. And not only that, but they're exfiltrating the data and, posting that data on like a publicly facing website, which then, is generally geared to create the victims, to pay even more. Again, auctioning off of the data, that's by Revel, the Soda Kenobi threat group that Mark touched upon. But I would also throw into the mix the ransomware as a service. That's something else that's been amping up, and that makes possible for just about anybody to become a cyber extortionist. It's sort of like, the software as a service. It's sold on a cloud-based subscription model. So that just increases the amount and the ability of individuals to infiltrate something like ransomware.
Yeah. And just picking up, Joe, before I move on to the others, in terms of the business that you're having to handle, the small versus the medium and large enterprises and organizations.
Yeah.
Are you seeing that shift? Are you seeing a shift there in any trends? Are the small businesses being targeted more? Are they more vulnerable, or is it more these actors are just going after whoever they can, wherever they can, or almost indiscriminately?
We've noticed in the last 2 quarters, and when I say the last 2 quarters, I say the fourth quarter of 2019, the first quarter of 2020. We're just now collecting the data on the second quarter, but it's very interesting that outside of the standalone cyber product line and that policy, Markel provides endorsements and buy-ups for some coverage on other product lines, variants from environmental, medical malpractice, the like, and what we're finding are those product lines, those industry classes are reporting more ransomware matters and reporting more matters in general. And so we're starting to see a trend of those entities and those industry classes sort of taking the idea around cyber coverage and cyber insurance a little more seriously and seeing it as a risk mitigating factor and looking for a full, complete policy, which covers first and third party, business interruption, everything we're talking about on the panel today. But we're seeing that because I think that those industries, one, are a little bit more vulnerable. There's a little less cybersecurity around them. They don't have the availability like large organizations for that kind of protection. And they're seeing that insurance is more of an option. And that's what we've been seeing, at least.
Yeah. Jennifer or Marissa, you'd like to add to that? Or deviate from that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, thanks. I definitely agree with Joe. I mean, just in terms of what we're seeing on the ransom, I do also notice, I think in the last year or so, is a real increase in the amount of the ransom. I remember when ransomware first started to become a more, if you will, popular action in this world, and it would be like 2-3 Bitcoin, a few $1,000s, call it a day. Now it's easily in the 6 figures, 7 figures. And that is true across the board. Kind of to go back to your question, Simon, I definitely saw I've seen some very small companies hit with ransom that you would expect maybe for a major Fortune 100 company. And I think to Joe's point, there's an assumption there that there's probably insurance, or hopefully that there's insurance there. Other than ransom being still such a big portion of our claims that we see, we also are seeing a definite increase in the last year or so in business email compromise claims. I think that goes hand in hand with what I've always seen a lot of, and I haven't seen a big change, and that is that human error action portion that Mark brought up earlier. Human error really is still it confounds me at times. Joe and Jen are probably slightly smiling at this. I can't see them, but it's just amazing to me how often people, they don't even look. It's so clearly, poor grammar. The email address isn't the same. There's such very obvious things, but they click on the link, they give their password, they give their information, or they send off the W-2 forms or whatever it is that the, quote unquote, sender is asking for. And so we've certainly seen a continuation of that human error factor being a large part You know, it always surprises me, and I always talk with my insured. Of course, it's after the fact, but for future about ramping up training and, you know, getting their folks a little bit more comfortable with asking the questions. I do think also there is a slight generational issue sometimes on the human error, which is I think that the younger generations are so used to kind of a virtual lifestyle that they don't even think to pick up a phone to confirm. They just, you know, sort of assume it's fine to just email back or to accept this on face value. Whereas, you know, in generations where people didn't even have cell phones when they were growing up or in their, you know, college and 20s years, might be more likely to follow up with a phone call. So, you know, I think that that continues to be a big issue. Like I said, leading to frequently a lot of ransom and business email compromise. And the one other thing that I've seen a lot more of recently is business interruption claims. And I suspect that that may not be because there are more of them. This is just my own non-scientific theory. But because, A, there's more coverage nowadays, and B, because folks are more savvy and recognize the availability under their policies of that portion of coverage. So we've certainly seen, Simon, you probably have too, I would imagine, seen a fairly big increase. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think my personal view on it is it's driven to a degree by the availability of the coverage now. And as you say, the knowledge, how savvy people are. They know there's coverage there for it. They've seen and read horror stories, although if they haven't seen and read horror stories, they have a friend who's in business that was the victim of an attack and saw that his business was shut down for 2 weeks. And, you know, that story that they're sharing is, it cost me, you know, $1 million in business. That reaction is to go out and seek some business interruption cover. So I think there's more of it around, and yeah, there's certainly, our world has changed. It's funny, I'll come to Jen in a minute on any comments that she has, but Mark, if you remember, you and I, we talked about business interruption, gosh, 11, 12 years ago in Philly, and I remember a few in the audience thinking, how's cyber and business interruption ever going to be connected? We're talking about technology, we're not talking about business operations. And here we are today with it being very prominent. Jennifer, any thoughts on, you know, from your point of view, the study and what it shows and highlights in terms of the world you're in?
Yeah, I do have a few thoughts. So 2019, I agree, it's not going to be a surprise for anybody to hear. It was the year of ransomware from our perspective. And I echo everything that Joe and Marissa said. There's been a real evolution in ransomware over the past few years. First, it was just one endpoint or a few endpoints and demands were low. And the value of Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrency it was super low. I remember when it was $300 for a Bitcoin. But then it became a network-wide infection. And sometimes you would have backups hit, but sometimes they weren't. And the demands were a little higher at that point in time. But if the backups weren't hit, you were restoring and moving along. But then it was network-wide, and then the backups were encrypted or deleted. And the demand was higher, and now they're not willing to negotiate. And then you see a willingness to negotiate, but then you start seeing the attackers accessing and exfiltrating data, but not publishing it, but instead just showing it to the victim organization saying, hey, we were in your system and we have your data. And sometimes they were showing things like bonus statements or cyber insurance declaration pages. We've seen that in a few cases too, when we have an organization that may be saying they have an inability to pay the demand or anything, and the attackers come back with proof of cyber insurance coverage being in place via the death page. So the attackers are becoming more sophisticated. But now we're seeing backups being encrypted and deleted, access and exfiltration of data, other malware being placed on the system prior to the ransomware being deployed, high demands, a reduced willingness to negotiate, and publication of information. So the evolution of ransomware and the behavior of the attackers has led to an evolution of cyber claims, because now you're hitting many more insuring agreements than you may have been hitting just a few years ago when you're experiencing a ransomware event. And for 2020, It's the year of many, many things, but I do think it's, again, another year of ransomware. We're seeing a lot of ransomware matters still come in. And on the business interruption piece, I do think that there are more organizations that now have coverage for business interruption than they did before. I think organizations are becoming better at quantifying exactly what the business interruption loss is with the assistance of people like you, Simon. But there also is a real increase in the amount of downtime an organization is having to respond to these events. The type of response that is needed to be undertaken to address these ransomware events is much more complicated than it was a few years ago. You need many more hands. It takes much more time. So I think there is an increase in actual legitimate business interruption losses happening to organizations now. But in addition to ransomware, I echo what Marissa said. Business email compromise, network intrusions, third-party vendor events, all very popular over the past year.
Just on the business income loss situation, and if nobody wants to comment, no problem. Do you think companies are underestimating, and you touched on it there, Jennifer, are they underestimating the time it will take to recover? In other words, getting that backup in place, they're very optimistic and they've done their cybersecurity assessment and they've had experts come in and say, look, this is what you should do and this is how you should do it. And then on the day that it's necessary, they think, it's going to take me, 7 days to restore my backups. And actually the impact from a business perspective is, 35 days because of, it just doesn't go smoothly, or maybe they underestimated what they would need to do to get back to normal. Is that a trend that we're seeing, or is it just my imagination on a few claims that I've been involved in?
Well, Simon, I would say that, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
You can follow up. I'm sure you'll have a good follow-up. I was just going to say that particularly with small and medium-sized corporations, what I have found is that, generally just by size, there can be a lack of sophistication, and that's brought on by, not having maybe any IT internal or just a person or two, not a big department or team. And I have often had small and medium-sized companies say, well, we have the backup, we're good, right? I mean, it should be a day or not even a day. You said 7 days, but even that, I've heard much less. I think there's a tendency just not having that sophistication just to not understand. I frequently explain to insureds that once you pay the ransom and you get that key, it's not like a lock in a door. We don't just put it in and turn in, everything is perfect. And they're often shocked to find out that weeks and weeks may go by and that all sorts of resources may be needed in order to make that happen, and we may have to go back to the threat actor if there are multiple keys and that there's an issue with some of the keys, and they have no idea that that's what may be involved. So I certainly do think that plays a big role in it. Yes, for sure.
Yeah. Jennifer?
Yeah, I think organizations are underestimating, even the organizations that go through the process of doing tabletop exercises, I still think they underestimate the actual effort that goes into gathering the artifacts needed for the investigation and also restoring from backups if that is an option. And I had a client about 2 months ago where they had backups that they could use, except they were being managed by a third-party vendor, and the third-party vendor was extremely difficult to work with, and it took weeks for us to get exactly what we needed to restore from. And they never estimated that. They just assumed they had backups, they were separate, they were accessible, and they were going to be good to go and able to restore quickly. But like Marissa said, it isn't a flip a switch once you get the key. Just because you got the key doesn't mean you're going to get immediate access back to the information on your systems. There's a process not only involved in the artifact gathering piece, but also the restoration piece if you're using the key or if you're coming back from a backup. And it usually takes much more time than organizations think it will. So we're always telling organizations, if you go through the effort of performing a tabletop exercise, that's wonderful. If your response to the event that you are doing in the tabletop is to restore from a backup, go through the effort of doing it. Try and do it and see exactly how long it takes and work out any kinks that you have that you identify throughout that process so that when you need to do it in the future, those kinks aren't going to be present and you're going to know how to handle the restoration process.
Yeah. So just to change direction just a little bit, it's obviously we cannot ignore COVID-19, and I'm just curious for those willing to just share any thoughts on how the trends that you've seen up to that point, let's say February, how have they changed since? And is there any sort of forecast of what they might look like for the balance of the year? Dramatically different or more of the same, I suppose, is really the question. I mean, anybody willing to comment?
You know, Simon, it's Joe. I would say more of the same, maybe potentially a lot more. I think at the onset of the COVID-19 situation, there was an expectation that, you know, cyber was going to have this immediate, tremendous impact. And, from talking, I think even in preparation and speaking with, Marissa and Jennifer in this, there wasn't maybe necessarily an immediate impact. In fact, there was potentially a slowdown in reported matters. But when you look at the statistics and you look at the reports as to what's really going on network, and I think it was IBM's X-Force that came up with a number like from March into April, there was like a 6,000% increase in spam-related, and phishing attempts with organizations trying to imitate things like the World Health Organization officials or like the U.S., Small Business Administration and banks that were, purporting to offer financial relief. And all of these were aggressive and large phishing campaigns that, for the threat actor, it is the perfect environment and temperature for social engineering attacks. But what's interesting is you may not see that impact because, as we were sort of alluding to in the ransomware discussion, these threat actors are coming in and sitting there for a little while and waiting for just the exact right moment. And this may not be the right moment, but, we're anticipating that, going forward, we're going to see, in a prolonged period, statistics that show that, COVID did have a significant impact. It's just not in the immediate term.
Yeah. I mean, the discussion I've heard and read and listened to is, you talk about what's the perfect time. And I've got it on the slide there, economic restart. It's starting, different states are starting at different speeds. But if there were an opportune, I hate to say, if there were an opportune moment when the time and the temperature is right to put additional pressure on a business, it's during this economic restart phase, where they can't face another 2 or 3 months of business interruption impact that might come from, a nasty ransomware attack. So, Mark, I want to switch to you because I know in planning this, you'd advise me, you're on a ransomware advisory group, so I'm just curious, I think, and the audience is probably curious to know what's the sort of tone of the conversation there with regard to the remainder of 2020.
So we have a ransomware advisory group, and we really just use that as a way for NetDiligence to gather intel for our cyber risk insurance partners, so we can pass on some lessons learned. And this group is made up of 20 of the leading forensic companies who are assisting Bridge Coach counsel like Jen Coughlin and, assisting the claims folks and just battling the threat actors on a daily basis. So it's very interesting to talk to these guys because they're in the front trenches. So some of the, one of the things Joe mentioned just about COVID, what's happening, we happen to ask them some of those questions recently. What are they saying? Is COVID-19 changing the landscape? And it was interesting to learn they do believe that there is an increase in ransomware events happening because of COVID, because of so many people working from home. And when that happens, your home users tend to have more lax security practices than if they were in a corporate setting. So one of the main ways the threat actors gain access or exploit ransomware events is through something called RDP protocol. Remote desktop protocol is left open, oftentimes accidentally, and the threat actors take advantage of that. And it's happening more and more now because there's more times where people working from home need their system administrator to remotely help them. And they just leave these tools on accidentally, and the threat actors are taking advantage of that. So that was one of the things they happened to highlight for us. The other thing they highlighted, we talked about business interruption here. I always assumed, I think wrongfully, that there's times where it could just be easier to pay bitcoins to the threat actor, if it was a reasonable amount, just to quickly get our decryption key, unlock our systems, and get back to things. And in reality, especially when you're talking about SME-sized organizations, they're highly unorganized. For all the reasons the experts on in this phone conversation already mentioned, they oftentimes don't have the right backup processes in place. The threat actors already got access to their backup system, so they're no longer viable. So what we learned was you can't, for a small entity to just go out and raise $500,000 in Bitcoin is easier said than done. Sometimes that will take them weeks and weeks and weeks just to get that authority together. And then they have to negotiate. Usually you have the experts doing that negotiation, but it just slows up the process generally. So they told us the average, if you're going to pay the Bitcoin route, was something like 3 to 15 days of business interruption exposure. If you had viable backups, you had a client who was doing all the right things. Let's say they segmented their backups from their corporate network, and they were using a cloud, say, that segmented. And so the forensic experts were able to help them get the viable backups and restore the backup. The average business interruption was significantly decreased, anywhere from 1 day to a max of, say, 10 days. So that's just some of the tidbits we get from these guys. But as we said earlier, it's so rapidly changing. You know, we talked about the new variants that they're uncovering that are evil. These guys are saying now, yes, you have the general ransomware happening where they're locking down your systems, demanding Bitcoins, and those demands are going up. And as Jen Coughlin said, many times they're not so willing to negotiate. But now they're also, as Joe mentioned, they're publishing your private information to amp up the pressure, sometimes just flat out auctioning it off. And some of the experts are even mentioning kind of a three-headed monster happening where they're going back to the executives and physically threatening them. And some of these executives now are taking a position where they actually have to go out and spend money on armed security services. They're that scared. So it's changing, and it's just trying to stay on top of the trends is the tricky part.
Indeed. Any other thoughts on the panel before I advance the slide? I think we're going to move on to a couple of other topics.
Yeah, this is Jen. I have a few thoughts on the COVID-19 impact. So I think there were some businesses that were definitely prepared to work remotely. Some had already had staff able to or working remotely, but there were a lot of organizations that had complete in-office staff and had to adopt mechanisms, really a first impression to them, to ensure their staff could continue to work while at home. But if they didn't prepare for it to happen, it was kind of a piecemeal approach. And we've all heard stories of staff being told to use just whatever device they can get their hands on to connect to the system and do the work. Just get the work done. Or IT being told to buy any and all laptops available for sale for use by their staff. Just get whatever you can and hand it out to staff. Or IT deploying devices previously removed for decommissioning. It was end of life for them so that staff would have devices to use while working remotely. And you now have devices that aren't being managed, devices that may not be encrypted, MFA may not be in place, employees may be storing information locally. But then you also have this added component of the furloughs and the layoffs that have happened throughout this process. And I'm not sure organizations are taking into account the shift in data privacy practices and the work that happened back in March, and what are they doing to get the information and devices back from these employees that are furloughed or being laid off. They're no longer employees of the organization. They no longer have authority to have access to that information. And I think there's a lot of events that are happening right now and ongoing, but are just not detected. And I know back in March there were a few attackers that said, we totally get what's going on, world. We're going to lay off on the essential workers like healthcare organizations. We're not going to hit them with ransomware now. But what they didn't say was, we're not even going to attempt to access their system, and we're not going to sit in that system until everybody goes back to work, and then we'll be detected. We're not going to do any of that. We're going to wait until everybody's healthy again and everybody's back in the office, and then we'll resume business as usual. You didn't hear any of that. So I think there's a lot of organizations that have been breached, and they don't know it yet, and there's somebody sitting in their system, possibly doing something now, possibly just waiting until they do something later.
Yeah, it's pretty dull. Okay, thanks to the panel. That's some great discussion on claims trends and what we have seen and what we expect to see. Going to move on to the next polling question. This is our third and final question. What is not classified as personal information under the CCPA? And the choices are there for you to select from: biometric information, professional or employment-related information, geolocational information, or all of the above. are classified as personal information. We're going to change the discussion a little bit onto privacy and cybersecurity claims, and really to put to the panel what's the shift in the balance of the claims that they're involved with or dealing with or seeing. And we'll talk a little bit about, obviously, GDPR, CCPA going into enforcement July 1, just around the corner. And then I want to touch and get the panel's experience or thoughts on how managing these claims differs, privacy versus the cybersecurity claims. So if I can turn to Joe first, we talked offline, obviously, about the impact in particular of CCPA, and you have some thoughts on that. I wonder if you share those with our audience.
Yeah, sure, Simon. So, I mean, as to the CCPA, as the slide indicates, enforcement by the California State Attorney General begins July 1. It took effect on January 1, and, one of the interesting components of the CCPA, and I think people are really going to be watching it, especially, probably, I guess, as of this recording, tomorrow, July 1, is, the CCPA provides for a private right of action if a California consumer's personal information is subject to an unauthorized access, or if it's, a disclosure due to a company's violation of its duty to implement, and, I quote the statute, reasonable security procedures. And an interesting factor to all this is that since the CCPA went into effect on January 1, there have already been at least 2 class actions filed that assert a CCPA cause of action in California. So one of those is Fuentes versus Sunshine Behavioral Group LLC, and the second being Atkinson versus Minted Incorporated. Now, as the statutory penalties can range, according to CCPA, from $100 to $750 per single violation, it's going to be interesting to see how those play out, how those class actions and how, those cases play out. And again, it's going to be interesting to see how the California State Attorney General chooses, which factors of the CCPA to enforce and which entities or industry classes to target. So it's a law that's in its infancy, but it's definitely gaining traction, by the day.
And I would imagine, that state by state, something similar is going to roll across the nation over time. Thoughts on that, Joe? And timing for that, I suppose. How quickly are other states going to follow along?
Well, it's true. Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I mean, I think that, look, you have the California versus New York factor, right? And you have the New York SHIELD Act that, implemented even further regulations back in mid-March, even amongst COVID. New York is, and they found it necessary, especially during COVID, to enforce further privacy law and further privacy, regulation. And so you have California versus New York. New York does not have that private right of action. It's definitely not as expansive as the CCPA. But, for those of us in New York, we've seen the legislature really advocate to match or even further enhance what California has already done. And then if you have other, states like Nevada and Washington to keep an eye out for who are taking note of what California is doing.
Marissa or Jen, any thoughts you want to add here on this issue?
I agree with everything Joe just said. Absolutely everything.
100% agreement.
I mean,
excellent.
That's easy. That's an easy slide. I too agree with Joe. But and I think too, just based on reading some of the legislative history and issues that went on in the passing of the bill, I certainly think that application is going to be very interesting. I am kind of stepping back and sort of watching it unravel, but I think there are going to be a lot of issues just in the way it's written and how it is interpreted and applied.
Any other thoughts from the panel on that, on those issues?
Simon, I just wanted to say really quickly for our friends across the pond, just in terms of the GDPR, it's interesting because that took effect May 2018. So we're a little over 2 years into the GDPR, and there's been this notice that originally at the implementation there was over-reporting taking place because everyone wanted to be compliant, but that slowed down. Definitely like the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO out of the UK, has reported that. And, there haven't been a lot of large fines on record, but just recently the French Council of State upheld a 2019 ruling by France's National Data Protection Commission against Google. And that one is in the amount of $56 million US dollars. And the other two sort of large notable ones are out of the ICO from the UK, which is the British Airways fine of $230 million, and Marriott, which is around 123. Yeah, EasyJet too is coming up in the news.
Situation too, yeah.
Right, and those, but just to note, for the audience, both of those funds, the British Airways and the Marriott, I'm not sure about the EasyJet, but those two are at least still on appeal. So the ICO has yet to, they've sent the notification to impose a penalty, but they haven't set a final number or amount yet.
Those are coming, yeah. Good stuff. Yeah. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, worth pointing out. Okay, I moved us on. We're going to talk a little bit, we're running up on time, so we'll talk quickly about the next couple of items. Jen, you wanted to give us some insight into trends in regulatory investigations, I think pre and post-COVID, if I'm not mistaken, how things have changed a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, the regulators are very much alive and well, and while they understand the current pandemic really is impacting all businesses, they're still expecting businesses to detect data privacy events and take appropriate action to investigate and respond to those events in a swift fashion. So we do have regulatory investigations still ongoing. We've had some that have commenced even after the pandemic began, and the regulators are being more understanding that an organization may need additional time to respond to an inquiry due to the COVID-19 related pressures that the organization may be facing, but we have not seen a decline in regulatory investigations in any way, shape, or form over the past year or so, including since the pandemic began.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Like I said, for the panel, anything else we need to address on regulatory investigations before I move us on? Just keep an eye on the clock here a little bit. There's lots to talk about, which is good to hear. We sort of try to wrap it up now. Just one more topic, and then we'll move into some closing remarks. Really just want to sort of touch on whether we're seeing continued challenges from the claims side with dealing with the issues that arise with claims being brought on various policies, either silent side that kicks in, or K&R policies, property policies that have been brought to the table, and just want to get some sense of whether that's a continued trend, is it a trend that's being managed well, and it is what it is sort of thing, or what's the thoughts that the panel has on that?
Hey, Simon, it's Joe. I'll jump in. I mean, because we're really talking about, I think the gist of this slide is really silent cyber. And I would just say, given the time limitations, insurers, I think everybody's learning, insurers need to make every effort to indicate, what their intent is for coverage of cyber-related perils through affirmative language if they want to affirmatively exclude, or they want to affirmatively cover, maybe just through a sublimit, just through the policy language before courts insert their own interpretations. I mean, earlier this year in January, we saw a case out of the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland. It was, the plaintiff's name was National Ink and Stitch, and in that one they were dealing with, a business owner's policy, BOP policy, and the court found the damage to software and the data stored in it was capable of sustaining a physical loss. Now, for the audience, if you go and research, you're probably going to find some analysis that, that was very policy language specific, and that's, what the court relied on in making its ruling. But, carriers need to be careful, because otherwise you might find yourself in a position where the courts and miseducated, misinformed, misunderstood judges are making these coverage decisions and really impacting the industry as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good thought. Anybody else want to comment on that before we wrap things up? Okay. So some closing remarks, really. I'll request from everybody, if you're willing. I mean, I say there on bullet point 3, are we going to predict anything? It would be really difficult, because we never saw NetDiligence as a virtual conference under social distancing, but here we are nonetheless. And again, thank you to the audience for its robust response to NetDiligence putting this as a virtual conference. Any surprises from the last 12 months, or even more recently, since we went into this work from home mode? Just open it up, really. Any thoughts as we look forward to the remainder of 2020? I'll start with you, Joe, maybe.
Okay.
Oh, go, Mark. Yep. Go ahead.
Okay, I was going to just jump in here. So two things. One is, I know we talk a lot about cybersecurity, but a big part of cyber risk, of course, is privacy. We're always interested in following where the plaintiff lawyers are going, and they increasingly are going after the classic wrongful collection, wrongful sharing of data. So we think that's going to continue to produce some large class action lawsuits and just significant risk for all organizations. And we spend a lot of time on the ransomware, question because it's the #1 cause of loss. We don't see that going away. All the experts we talk to are just shocked. When you're shocking an expert who deals with this every day, that's saying something. They're shocked at how the threat vectors change, how the demands, continue to grow. So we're always continuing to keep our eye on that one.
Thanks, Mark. Joe?
Whenever somebody asks me for a prediction these days, I say IoT. I mean, I think that just sort of needs to be on people's radars. You laugh probably because we've had that discussion, but ransomware definitely maintains its celebrity status. But I think that around the corner is issues around surrounding IoT and the function of that and the impact of that if the attack were to happen. So that's my 2 cent prediction.
Thank you, Marissa.
Well, I'm going to leave the predictions to Joe, but what I will say is that, I think what continues to be challenging to some degree and also just a real focus for those of us handling these kinds of claims, and I say that both from the claims and legal perspective, is just really keeping up on a constantly developing and changing technology. Kind of to go back to the beginning when Joe was talking about the level of sophistication of a lot of these threat actors. And, it's been very eye-opening for me recently in learning more and more about the technology side. And as you do that, it really it assists you in handling the claims, but, it's always changing. So I always feel as though I'm a little behind the 8 ball and I need to catch up. So I think that will continue to be important for those of us involved in the cyber claims world.
All right. And last words from Jen.
Sure. So I think there are some things that aren't going to change. We're going to continue to be relying upon technology. We're going to continue to have criminals that are very active. We're going to continue to have failures in technology and security regardless of how much we prepare and how much we invest in it. And we're always going to have human error. So I think the trends aren't going to go in the opposite direction from what they've been going in thus far. And I think we're going to have a lot of undetected events detected later in the year. We're going to have attackers continue to be unpredictable, and we're going to have an opportunity for everybody to improve efficiencies in the incident response process. We've seen the claims costs, like Mark said earlier, they have just ballooned, and there are opportunities for people to drill down on them a little more and see what we can do better. And I know that we're working with a lot of people to do that, and I think that's going to be an effort that continues throughout the remainder of this year and next year and beyond.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you. Listen, I'd like to thank the panel. Thank you all tremendously for the contributions. It's been wonderful. And I'd like to obviously thank the audience for signing up for this session. If there are questions, we run out of time for questions, so unfortunately we can't do that. But if you do want to send questions to us, I know that the panel and myself have all agreed we'll happily get back to you on those questions as they come through. And we look forward to hearing from you. So thank you very much, everybody.